Tony. The video you're going to watch now, we're going to show you some basic maintenance on your tattoo machine. How to change the front and back springs and how to keep the machine adjusted during a tattoo. These are things that you want to really know how to be able to do when you're going to tattoo somebody. You don't want to start out with your machine and not know how to adjust something if something goes out. So watch the video. You're going to need a set of front points. It's a front spring with a contact point, a back spring. This is a point file. You're going to need that for cleaning up the points on the machine. A set of Allen keys. These are the little grommets that go on the front of the machine for the needles that hold the needles on there. So you want to keep a good assortment of those. These you're going to change pretty often. A set of rubber bands, which you saw in the first video, how that holds the needle into the machine. And this is a set of coils. You can get a matching set for your machine, and it's a good idea to keep a set of these around too. If something happens to your machine during a tattoo, you're going to need to know how to replace any of these parts so you can finish your tattoo. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how to take the back springs off, the front springs off, so you can take a look at the contact points and check on your machine. If you're in the middle of a tattoo and it's not running, if you start getting an excessive amount of spark or the machine's just not running the way it should, it's probably due to the fact that one of these springs here has either got a crack in it, it's not bent right. There's a lot of little things you have to play around with, and that's why you want to keep those extra parts around. So it's pretty simple to take apart. Every machine is going to have the little Allen screws on there, so you just find the right one that takes these out of here. This little grommet, this type washer spring, this is just a little grommet I've got on there that keeps this front spring from rattling. Some machines have these, some don't. If yours doesn't, it's not a major thing here. It's just a different type of machine. So you take that off. What you want to do is loosen these two screws right here. If you take the back one off first, just put your Allen key in there and give it a turn. You can swing this out and everything will come right off. That's your armature bar is attached. You want to make sure, before you even start to do your first tattoo, take your machine apart one time so you know exactly how it all works and how it goes back together. So if you're in the middle of a tattoo and you have to change something, it should only take you a second to do it. And then you can just loosen this screw, and that'll separate the two springs, your back spring and your front spring. Just loosen that up. You can take these all the way off. This one will just slide right out. That's your front spring. This one you have to take the screw completely out of here, off the armature bar. And then you can separate all that. On the back side of the armature bar, you'll see they'll start getting little dents and things in them. That's from where they're tapping on top of these two coils. You know, every once in a while, even if the machine's running good, you're going to want to take this apart and just clean all these contacts. They can get worn out and they can get out of. These should be nice and flat. So, you know, you don't want to make sure everything is nice and clean on the machine. So that's how you take those two parts off. If you ever have to change your coils, this is something you're not going to want to do in the middle of a tattoo. If your machine goes bad, you're going to have to take some time. All these parts are soldered together. Your coils are soldered onto your capacitor, and that comes up to the front points. So those are things you're going to really want to make sure all your soldering joints are good before you start a tattoo. You don't have any loose wires or anything. One little loose wire on any of these things, your machine will start running. It'll kick on and off. It'll sound like you have a short in the machine, which obviously you do. Okay. That little points file I was telling you about, the top part of this is your top contact point here. These things should always be filed, and you want to keep them really flat. So when it's making contact with that front spring, you got a good connection here. So every once in a while throughout when you're working on a tattoo, if all of a sudden your machine starts to sputter a little bit, it may just be simply that you need to file those points and get them flat again and get any buildup that they'll get a little carbon buildup in there just from sparking in there. And that's pretty much how to take the basic part of the machine apart. When you buy this contact springs and the fronts and back springs, if you'll notice there's a slight bend in these. A lot of these will come and they'll be just perfectly flat and straight. So what you want to do is take your machine apart when you know it's running good, when you first get your machine. Take an extra set of these springs that you bought, lay them down flat, and make sure that they have the same exact bend in them. To bend them, it's pretty simple. You can just grab this with a pair of pliers and just slowly bend this spring. It's spring steel, so you want to get a nice little angle on there. That's going to determine how far of a throw you have in your machine. And the same thing with the front. You got the same thing on there. You've got a little bend in the spring. Most of these will already come with a factory bend in them on the front springs, so you can pretty much leave those alone. You don't normally have to make any bends. As you get more experienced and tattoo a little bit more, you'll see how you want your machine to run, and you can make adjustments just by bending these springs, so the amount of the throw from the needle to the tube will be determined by how far that's bent. What we're going to do is we're just going to put this thing back together, and we'll kind of go through what it should sound like and all the adjustments that are made. So what you want to do is obviously put your back spring back on first, so just put the screw back in. You don't have to worry about making any big adjustments right here, right now. Just kind of get the machine put back together, and then you can play around with all the different settings on there, and I'll adjust this for you, and I'll show you how it all adjusts and that's set. So just screw this back in there. You can leave it a little bit loose here till you get your front spring set. Make sure you put the back spring on first. There's you've got the Allen screw, and then there's a little washer, and then the front spring goes underneath that washer, so it's kind of stacked on there. And set that. You notice that there was that slit in that front spring. You've got a little slit in there. This one, because that way you can adjust this front to back. Once that one's pretty much set where it's going to go. It's got a slit in the back, so you're adjusting that whole armature bar, so make sure it lines up with the points on the machine. So once you get that where it's tight enough where it'll kind of hold together, you want to make sure this is all lined up. You want to make sure this is lined up, this is lined up. Everything is straight with the armature bar. And then you just slide it back in. You've got the same thing basically on the back of the machine. There's just an Allen screw with a washer, and the washer is going to be on top. So set your back spring in there. You can see where the contact points are going to meet. So just kind of turn it and get it lined up to where that's where they're going to meet. Once you get them pretty much where they're going to line up, just tighten up that screw a little bit, and you'll see it start coming up. And you can pretty much, if you've got that one set, just make sure everything is in line. That this spring is in line with that spring, and it's in line with the armature bar. The armature bar that's connected with this back spring, you want to kind of turn your machine over, look up inside the hole here where the tube goes, and make sure that the armature bar is even with that hole, so it's kind of lined up almost like a sight, because that's where your needle's going to run down this hole. So you don't want to have this armature bar too far back or too far out. If everything's lined up, the needle will flow right through the machine real good. So just torque down this back spring. Don't over tighten anything on this thing. Just get it to where it's snug and it's not going to be moving around. And then just set your front spring back up, get it lined up, and tighten that one down. Once you got everything tightened down, that's pretty much what it should look like. So you got a nice spring to it. You're going to have a little bit of a gap between there. I had a dime and a nickel sitting out here for a reason. You can set your machine, you can set the gap of these points with a dime. A dime is good for outlining. So what you want to do is pull this down until it touches the coils and see if a dime fits in there. If it's loose, you can just tighten this top point right up and down. You can just move it up and down till you get it. When you're doing shading pieces, you're going to use it about the thickness of a nickel. So it depends on what you're going to do. You can actually set a machine somewhere in between the two and not have to switch machines or switch any adjustments in between tattoos. You can get your machine set up where you can outline and shade with the same machine. Some people like to use two different ones. You can have yourself two machines set up. You can have one already set up for an outliner, one set up for a shader. And once you have those set, that's pretty much what you need to do a tattoo. I'm going to plug this in and you can hear it run, and we'll see if it needs any adjustment once it's running. And again, I don't use a clip cord. Most machines have a clip cord. This one is using a standard RCA jack to run it. So we'll set that and we'll just see. Once you hit your machine, you should get it so if it starts to move, that's fine. If it's not moving, there could be a couple problems here. I'm gonna knock this out of adjustment so you can see what'll happen. If this set of points is twisted down too far, I'm stepping on my pedal and it's either going to run too fast or too slow, or it'll just stop altogether and you won't get any adjustment out of the machine at all. So you want to just back that thing off, make sure everything is tight. You know, you can make different adjustments. You can tighten these springs up a little bit if they're rattling too much. You want them so you can't move them by hand. They should stay pretty standard. And then you can hear the difference. I'm just going to keep adjusting way out and way in with this machine. Now if the points are too far away, see how it'll slowly, now I have no contact between this spring and my point, so I'm stepping on my pedal and I'm getting nothing. Once that, you keep tightening this down until you start, now I'm starting to get some contact, make the adjustments. And that's pretty much what your machine should sound like. So just remember, when you're adjusting your machine, this is probably the most critical adjustment, is going to be your top adjustment right here, where you can turn this back and forth to set the speed of the machine. And once you get it where you want it, that's it. Stop the machine, tighten down this little Allen key with the Allen key right here. That little Allen screw actually goes right through here and makes contact with this. So as you're running the machine, this thing will vibrate and it can just keep turning and it'll knock it out of adjustment. This screw here holds this thing tight, so you'll never have any problem with the contact point coming loose. And that's pretty much it. You're pretty much set and the machine's running. After you get your machine completely adjusted, you're going to want to put it in, take one of your tubes and a needle, and just set it back up again and run it for a second and make sure it sounds good. So I'll go through it again. You know, just take your grommet, put it into your needle, run that down your machine, put that on the armature bar, loosen up the chuck, slide your tube down, and you're going to want to set that in there. You know, and adjust it just like you're going to do a tattoo. Remember I showed you on the first video where you want to set that needle. So, you know, set it up just like it's going to run during a normal tattoo. You want to have that all set up. Your rubber bands, I use 2 rubber bands on them. That's always a good thing to do. Just hook that to the back, anywhere onto the back of the machine like that. Stretch it down and around the front and get them over your needle bar. Make sure these rubber bands aren't all twisted up and overlap, and get them to ride on there so they're nice and even. You know, so you got a nice even space between them and everything. Tighten everything up, tighten the chuck up on here again, get your tube set, tighten that down. And we're going to plug it in and run it a little bit, and we'll see how it sounds and how it runs. Either hook your clip cords on or plug it in, whichever one you're using. And it should run real nice and smooth like that, you know. And again, if you need to make any adjustments, this is the critical adjustment right here. I've got my power unit set at about 10 volts on this one right here. And you'll see your power adjustment on the box itself. Your machine, when you buy a machine, it will always tell you where to set your box at. So that adjustment, that's kind of your own discretion. It'll tell you to set it at 10 volts. If you want to jack up a little bit more voltage or a little less voltage, that's kind of up to you. But set it at the standard setting and then make your adjustments right on the machine itself. So get that machine so it's, you don't want that thing to rattle. You want it to run just about like that. So you get a nice smooth run to it. Once you get that adjusted, just make sure everything is tight on here so that now nothing will move. So now your needle is going to run nice and smooth right down the tube. It's not dragging down in here anywhere. There's no resistance. Everything should run nice and smooth and quiet. Just like that. And everything's running. If you start to get a lot of splatter when you start to tattoo, sometimes just by a simple thing, by taking these rubber bands and moving them down a little bit closer to the tube, it'll just set the vibration. Those rubber bands are keeping that needle from going back and forth, and if it's going back and forth in the tube down here, you'll start getting ink splattering. So sometimes you can just move your rubber bands around to keep the ink from splattering out. You can hear how much faster it runs when I take the tension off, and then when I put it back on. It kind of smooths out the whole running of the machine. And that's pretty much your setup and ready to go ahead and tattoo. you've got everything all set. I was talking about before having two separate machines. It's not a bad idea to have two machines. You should always have a spare one on hand, because if one of these coils goes out or that capacitor burns out in the middle of a tattoo, like I said, you're not going to have time to readjust all this, take all this apart, take the coils and break them down. You're going to want to have another machine. You're going to be able to pick it up and just continue on to the tattoo till you can get back and fix the one that you have. So, you know, you might want to keep an extra machine around. It's not a bad idea. This one is all set up and ready to go. You should also have your other one. Do the same adjustments on it. If you don't feel comfortable enough adjusting, there are companies that you can send your machine to that will adjust them for you. But you really should learn the basic maintenance on them, as far as changing the springs and simple things like that. Front and back springs, adjusting the coils, you know, all that you should know how to do on your own machine. What I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you how to take the coils out of these machines. There's going to be a time comes when you're going to have to change them, so we'll show you how to do that. I got a couple different machines here. This is the one I was showing you before, and it's this one. To get the coils out, you've got an Allen key. This particular machine here uses just a standard head screwdriver. Some may have a Phillips head screw. They're all a little different. You're also going to need, if you're going to change coils and things, it's a good idea to have some heat shrink tubing. It comes in a variety of sizes and colors and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter. You're going to want to use some of this stuff on your capacitor wires. There's a couple other spots you can see on the bottom of the coils. There's a small piece of that heat sink, so your wires aren't going to make any contact with the frame of the machine. That'll cause it to short out. I'll take a set of these apart and I'll give you an idea how it works. In fact, we'll do this one. It's done with a screwdriver. It's pretty simple. You just loosen the bottom screws of the coil. When you put these back together too, you want to make sure these are good and tight in there. This is going to loosen up the coils right here. If you want, just to make it simple, you probably want to take your springs off so you have some room to work. Remember how we did it on the other machine here? We just took the set screws out. Okay, so just loosen these coils up. Sometimes you'll get a machine where your wires will break. We were talking about that earlier. And you're going to have to do this, or the machine's just not running correctly anymore. It starts getting real weak in power, and that's what you're going to have to do, is you're going to have to take these coils apart. Usually when you buy these coils, they'll come already soldered together. They're in a series, and you can see how this kind of works here. I'm going to move some of this out of the way. Okay. It's very simply, the two coils are connected here. And then there's one wire off of the bottom of this coil that's going up to the points, and there's another set here that goes to the back post, and that's also connected to the armature. I'm sorry, to the capacitor. So you've got the capacitor on here. So to get this all apart, this is where you're going to get bad connections. You're going to get bad connections right here. Sometimes they'll just break. You may get one that it just breaks completely off of the coil itself. These two coils are joined together. Sometimes this connection can get bad right in here. And you can see again, there's a little bit of that heat shrink tubing that's over this. This is done with black, but you can put a little bit of that tubing over, and you just heat it very slightly and it'll shrink down and tighten up around the wires. Okay, so you're pretty much going to take the whole machine apart to get to all this stuff. The point connector, this one, again, this one's all done with a standard screwdriver. Every machine's a little bit different. Just be very aware when you're taking these machines apart, when you're going to this length, there's a lot of little washers and things that'll come off of them. So you want to make sure you get them back in there the same way. You've got some spacers in here behind this bar right here. There's a plastic spacer on this side, a plastic spacer on this side, and then there's just some little washers that are in there. So you want to make sure that you get those all back in the same spot. If you have two machines that are the same, don't take them both apart at the same time. Keep one for an example on how to put it back together in case you get something messed up there. I'm going to take this back post off, and we'll pretty much have this machine stripped down to nothing.
there's your basic machine frame. That's all it is. A lot of guys, you can just buy different frames if you want. You could take the parts off of your machine, put them back on, different frame styles. You know, this is a pretty basic machine here that I'm showing you. And here's those coils. So this is where your soldering connections are going to come in. You know, so if you have a little experience with soldering, you're going to solder the capacitor is going to be soldered to the back post. The capacitor right there, and then we've got the two coils here like I was showing you before. This coil is soldered onto that post there, and this one's onto that side, and then again the two are linked together. So what you're going to want to do, you can see all the heat shrink on here. This isn't black wire. The wire is actually a reddish gold color. When you buy the coils the first time, you can see they're wrapped, and they normally have a red wire that's it's a coating that's on the wires. You want to take that coating off of those wires with a little piece of sandpaper or a little rub it against a file, because that red coating will, if you just twist them together like this and put a solder joint here, that red coating that's on the wire won't make a good connection, and you'll have a real problem with your machine. You'll put it all back together, boy, everything's connected, but it doesn't run. And that's a real common problem that guys run into. They'll put the machines together and they can't figure out why they're not running, because that coil wire is still got the coating on it. So you really need to make sure that's all off there. Soldering connections have to be done well. I mean, you can't just have big blobs of solder. You can see these are soldered flat onto the post. You know, if you get a little ball of solder, you can always file it off so it's nice and clean. Take that screw out of there so you can see all the solder connections. So it's relatively simple. I mean, there's not much. It's just a continuous loop here, you know, to put the coils back in the machine. You don't want to be afraid to get into taking your machine apart like this. I told you before, when you get your machine, it's always good. When I started out, I had two machines that were identical. I laid one down and took one apart, and then as I put it back together, I looked how the other one was done. These coils are I would probably change them maybe once a year. You'll start to tell. Sometimes you can't tell. You'll keep making adjustments on your machine here, and you're adjusting the post and you're adjusting everything here, thinking that, oh geez, my machine's just running a little slow, it's out of adjustment. Sometimes you'll start to adjust these to the point where you've got this cranked down, you've got everything done, and you're still not getting the power out of the machine that you need. That's when you know it's probably time to change those coils out. The capacitors, they'll probably burn out maybe once or twice a year. You're going to have to replace those. And again, you'll be able to tell. You'll start getting a real excessive amount of carbon buildup on here. Sometimes you'll start seeing a spark shoot between the point connection on the machine. As it's going, you're going to see a spark flying between there. You either know that this capacitor is either disconnected somewhere on here, or it's just plain simple, it's gone bad and it's time to change them. Make sure when you buy the capacitors, they're all rated differently. There's some little numbers on the side of there. Make sure you get the same type. Usually where you bought your machine from, they sell a complete line of supplies for all that kind of stuff, new coils and things like that. The coils here have this wrap around them. They normally, when they come, they're just a black, it's like a black electrical tape. So you can put all kinds of fancy little coil wraps on there just to give it a different look. And then basically what you're going to do, as long as you got your machine completely apart, you know, when it's a real good idea to take it and you can clean it real good, clean all your frame parts out, you know, any dust or dirt that got into the machine, you know, take the set screws out, make sure the threads are all good and clean, and then you pretty much solder your things all back together. This is how the components should totally look when it's all soldered back together, just like that. 90% of the time when you buy these coils, you'll get them where they're already soldered together like this. This particular set I soldered together myself. I bought them individually. This is an 8-wrap set of coils. This one's 10. You can see the difference in the size. The size is going to determine how the machine's going to run. The ones with the bigger coils in them are going to run a little smoother, a little quieter. These smaller coils, tend to run the machines a little faster. And you're going to probably, when you buy your first machines, this is probably what you're going to buy if you're buying a basic machine. You're going to probably get something with a small wrap. If you can afford to and you can get the bigger coils in the machines when you're looking to buy one, that's what you want to look for. 12 wrap coils, as opposed to 8s. You know, you can get 8s, 10s, 12s. So the bigger the wrap in the coil, it's going to be a little bit bigger. It's going to make the machine run better. All machine frames won't fit a bigger set of coils in them either. So if you happen to buy a machine that's got small set of coils in it and you want to switch them over to the bigger ones, better make sure you buy them from the same manufacturer and check with them to make sure that those coils will fit into this frame when everything's put back together. Sometimes you'll go to put your armature bar back on and you'll find that those coils are just too large. And I've seen guys where they've bent the springs up like this. It doesn't make the machine run right. You have to get the right size coils for the frame that you have. So that's basically what you want to look for when you're going to do that. Putting it together is pretty simple. I mean, it's basically just what I did. You know, we can just screw the coils back down, and when you're putting these things back together, you want to be extremely careful not to pull any of these wires apart. Guys have soldered them together, and you get them back together, and you don't realize this wire is so thin in here. You know, bent too many times, it's going to break. When you're done with this, when you get this back together, you want to tuck this stuff all the way in here. Keep the wires all nice and neat. You don't want wires and stuff all hanging out. Everything should be cut short, cut the length so it all fits. This one has a couple other wires on it. It's got one jumper because I was showing you before, I used, instead of a clip cord, I've got an RCA jack on this machine. There's several different types that you can get. All the machines basically look the same. They all come apart the same. You'll find that as you work with different machines, you're going to find they have different settings and different ways that they're put together. Different types of clamps for the chuck and stuff like that. I'll show you one other machine. Now this machine's a little bit different. This is a brass machine. It's just a little heavier frame than this type of machine is. Some people prefer a little bit more weight. You know, I do when I'm tattooing. This is one of the ones I started out with, was a smaller machine. I went to this machine. Now I'm up to something a little bit heavier, and you can see the coils. This has got a 12 wrap coil. It's got a little bit different setting on the front that holds your tubes. This is a guillotine type. On this machine we had just a wing nut that squeezes it together to hold the tube. I prefer this. The guillotine type is nicer. You get a little bit better tightening down. Just little bar slides back and forth as you adjust the knob. And you can see it's basically the same thing. This one's put together with Allen screws. Again, all the wires nice and tucked in. Nothing's hanging off of the machine. You don't see any wires hanging out. And you can see the heat shrink real good on this machine. It's right up in here. This black everything is done with heat shrink. You want to make sure, because if this wire is touching this part of the frame, you're going to have a problem. It's definitely going to short out. So make sure when you put your machines back together, that's something I can't stress enough. Make sure there's no exposed wires. Everything is covered. If you can't find some heat shrink, this little tubing, which you should be able to, even if you have to take electrical tape and cut it in small strips and put it behind there, just so you don't have anything touching, because it'll never run right. I was showing you before on the washers, on these little Teflon washers are so important when you're putting the screws back together, because they're insulating the screw from the frame. So there's a little Teflon washer on each side before the screw goes back in when you're putting everything together. And that's basically keeping that screw where you're going to connect everything to away from making any contact with that frame. Once you to have it all back together again, turn your power machine on, your power box, set everything just like you did before. I showed you in the beginning. You know, readjust the springs, readjust your point connections, make sure everything's running. If you put it together and you're hitting it and you're getting a flat spot, it's just not going. Again, go back and check all those wires. Make sure you got the coatings off of those wires. Everything is tucked in nice and nothing is shorting out against the frame. That's probably the most common thing that happens when guys will take their machines apart, is putting all the wires back in. They're handling all this stuff, you know, and they're putting these coils back down, and they're messing with it, and they don't realize that wire is pretty fragile in between the two coils. That thing breaks when you're putting it together. You might not even notice it, and your machine's just not going to run. You're going to have to start from scratch and go back over it. But again, don't panic when you're taking it apart. Go slow. Like I said, if you have an extra machine, if you have two machines that are identical, You know, you can lay them next to each other. You can look at how it is when it's all put together, and you won't have a problem. That's what I had here. I have two machines that are pretty much identical, and that's what I did. When I first started out, just take one apart, keep that as your model, use this one as the one you're taking apart, and see how it all works. Again, you're going to probably want to do this when you first get the machine, so if you do have a problem, you're going to know what to do. You're not going to be stuck and go, God, how do I get this apart? And you know, it looks so complicated, and it's really, really simple. It's very simple. So you shouldn't have any problems with that. Just, you know, refer back to this tape if you have any problems, and your machine should run sweet once you get all the new parts put on it. It should run much better. So that's how you put the machine together.